And joining us now, Milan Markovic. He is a graduate teaching fellow at Temple University's Beasley School of Law, and we're grateful to have you in our studio tonight.
It's great to be here, Steve. Thank
Let
you.
me set this up a little bit, because the International Court of Justice recently made a decision related to Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence, and we want to talk about the potential implications of that here in Canada on, obviously, a potential unilateral declaration of independence for the province of Quebec. I want to start, Milan, by just reading part of the 1999 United Nations resolution dealing with the international community and Kosovo. Here it goes. The commitment of all United Nations member states to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the other states of the region. The international civil presence will oversee the transfer of authority from Kosovo's provisional institutions to institutions established under a political settlement. That seems to lay it out fairly clearly about what the path towards potential independence for Kosovo is supposed to take. Did that in fact happen?
No, and in fact, that was Serbia's key contention before the World Court, the International Court of Justice. They essentially said the framework that was established by the United Nations meant that the separation or secession can only occur through a negotiated settlement.
Well, they did try negotiating.
They did, but the problem is with the negotiations, the position of the Kosovo delegation from the beginning was nothing except independence will work for Kosovo. And they had a variety of reasons for this. They also were not willing to consider any partition of their territory. So essentially, from the beginning, the Kosovo delegation had that position, and the Serbian position was, we're willing to give you autonomy, but not outright independence. So neither side really budged very far during the course of the negotiations.
So they just went for the unilateral declaration of independence.
Exactly. And they made no bones about this. They essentially said negotiations have not gotten us anywhere, and we are declaring independence unilaterally.
Which anybody can do, but it's one thing to do it, it's another thing to get the world to recognize it, and we'll come to that in a second. The International Court of Justice got involved. What, in fact, were they asked to do?
They were asked to determine whether the Declaration of Independence by the Kosovo's leaders was in accordance with international law. The way they actually determined that it was in accordance was by stating that there was no international law prohibition against declarations of independence by separatist groups. And that's all well good, obviously, for Kosovo, but the reasoning could be applied to any number of separatist groups. And obviously, you mentioned the issue of Quebec earlier, and that might be something that might be of interest to Canadians in particular.
We're going to get to that in a second. But upon what basis did the International Court make its eventual ruling?
They looked at the framework for previous countries that declared their independence, and they noted that international law did not preclude any of these other entities. The only clear instances where declarations of independence were not allowed was where there was violence or some other violation of international law. That obviously did not occur with the declaration made by Kosovo's leaders. So essentially the court said international law seems to be agnostic about declarations of independence, and that the obligation to respect territorial sovereignty, which is one of the bedrock principles of international law, only applies to states and not to individuals and groups, such as Kosovo's leaders.
You've studied this?
Yes.
Do you think the court made the right decision?
I think that the court made a very narrow decision. And not to give you an overly lawyerly answer, but Serbia and a lot of other countries wanted them to look a lot more at whether a unilateral declaration of independence will have the effect of creating secession. They did not analyze that question. They only looked very narrowly whether the actual act of declaring the independence is contrary to international law.
And they said no.
And they said no, exactly. Under that narrow reading, I think it is not very contestable. However, query whether the court might have wanted to go a little bit further to give some guidance to other nations having problems with groups that seek independence.
So you would have preferred a kind of broader undertaking as they looked at that, and they didn't do that.
I think a lot of countries and a lot of leaders would have preferred a broader undertaking, yes.
Okay, let's talk, as we suggested a second ago, about whether or not this has any implications for us here in Canada. What do you think the impact of that decision could be on the secessionist movement in Canada?
I think it actually has potentially a bigger impact on Canada than it does on Serbia. In fact, since the court's decision, only 1 or 2 additional countries have recognized Kosovo's status as an independent country.
We're one of them.
Well, we recognized it actually before the court ICJ's decision. Canada recognized it shortly after the United States did. The impact on Canada, I think, is really with how seriously and how much confidence we can have in the Clarity Act. The Clarity Act established certain conditions that need to be met before Quebec can secede from Canada. Well, it's an open question whether the leaders of Quebec will want to choose that framework when international law seems to permit them to unilaterally declare their independence and then simply rely on politicking to get individual countries to recognize them.
Let's just go back a little bit here, remind everybody. The Clarity Act, Jean Chrétien government, Stéphane Dion, I think, the father of it, so to speak, and set up, I guess, a series of markers that any secessionist movement would have to overcome in order to have Quebec become independent. And your reading of this international court decision suggests that the Clarity Act may not have the effect that the government of Canada hopes it will. Is that right?
I think that's correct. And this is something actually our own Supreme Court recognized, that essentially declaring independence is a political act, not just an act under law, domestic or international law. And I think they have not only do they have the International Court's decision that says declarations of independence are not contrary to international law, they also have the fact that Canada recognized Kosovo's independence, even though Kosovo did not have a referendum. There did not seem to be meaningful negotiations between the two sides. There certainly was not the kind of back and forth that is contemplated by the Clarity Act, such as that the House of Commons, for example, has to certify the results of any referendum. So I think it's not only the international law reasoning of the World Court, but also the fact that Canada, unlike a lot of other countries that have problems with separatist groups, like Spain, seem to agree that a unilateral declaration of independence can cause a country to secede.
Do you find it curious that the government of Canada, given our own particular connection to this issue, did this, that they actually endorsed the unilateral declaration of independence?
I do, and I think what's even kind of potentially more troubling is not so much that the Harper government recognized it, but that no major political party at any point said, perhaps we need to slow down here. There are some other countries, democracies like Spain, that have not recognized Kosovo's independence. Maybe we want to analyze in depth what the meaning of this is for Canada.
But Spain didn't, for their obvious reasons. They've got a similar problem.
Right, and we have the Quebec issue here. And the way that the Harper government tried to distinguish it was by relying on the fact that there were human rights violations in Kosovo. And that's obviously a very fair point, and that is something that's important to note. But the World Court specifically did not rely on any human rights violations that occurred in Kosovo to form the basis of its ruling.
Do you know why they didn't take that into account?
They simply noted that there are a number of different views whether there is a right to secede based on human rights violations. In addition, whether even Kosovo would constitute such a case. So this was something that the court noted certain parties had advocated, but they did not look at it to determine that Kosovo's declaration was permissible under international law.
Okay, you've made the case that there are some analogous things worth pursuing between the Yugoslavia-Kosovo case and the Canada-Quebec case. But we do have to follow up on the human rights angle, because that, it seems to me, is key. There's nothing analogous between what the Kosovar Albanians went through with the Serbs and what Quebecers are going through with the government of Canada, right?
I could not agree with you more on that point.
So doesn't that suggest then that the analogy can only be taken so far?
I think that's a very fair point. But the key is, what role does the human rights violation play in the legal analysis? Certainly, it did not play a role in the World Court's decision. In addition, let's keep in mind that Kosovo declared its independence not under the rule of Milosevic. In fact, they declared their independence when Serbia was a democratic country and was making very good steps to move towards the European Union. So while I think it's perfectly fair to note that, I also think it's a little bit simplistic. And also, I think there is potentially dangerous precedent there. Because once you start saying that human rights violations allow a group to secede, then you get into the very thorny question of what kind of human rights violations. Would, for example, the events that occurred during the October crisis under the rule of Trudeau be a possible basis back then for Quebec to declare its independence?
Okay, but even that, there was no comparison between, and I'm not defending what went on then or anything like that, but there's no analogy between what Trudeau did then and what Milosevic did either, right?
No, you're completely right about that. I guess the only point I'd like to make about the human rights angle is this is something that has been pushed by the Canadian government, but the World Court simply did not consider it. And I'm only noting as an international law principle, it is something that can be open to interpretation and, in fact, misinterpretation.
Okay, Milan, did the Harper government place any conditions on Canada's recognizing Kosovo's legitimacy?
No, and that I found very puzzling. They certainly could have noted that not only because of the human rights situation, but because of the fact that a referendum would have been a formality in the Kosovo case. They could have also noted that the particular case of the UN scheme that was established and the breakdown of negotiations, these are various factors that could have entered into its decision. The only remark I could find justifying the decision to recognize Kosovo was by former Foreign Minister Bernier saying that the human rights situation made it completely different than Kosovo. And given the decision of the World Court that did not rely on the human rights angle, I think that's a little bit simplistic.
Do you think our government made the wrong decision in recognizing Kosovo's independence?
I respect the fact that Canada is a country that honors the rights of people to determine their own fate. So I have no problem with them recognizing Kosovo's independence. What I do not understand is why it was not done in such a way to make clear that there were some concerns about the way this was done by Kosovo's leaders. Not only because of the UN resolution specific to Kosovo that you read earlier, but also because in general, we would like countries to separate by negotiating a settlement, such as was done in the case of Czechoslovakia, such was done in the case of Montenegro separating from Serbia, and that simply is not what happened here. What happened here was Kosovo was under an interim UN rule that stated that Yugoslavia's sovereignty would be respected, and then Kosovo's leaders declared independence after a period where there were not really good faith negotiations between the sides.
And got lots of countries around the world to recognize that independence.
They've got 70 countries to recognize their independence, but even from their perspective, I don't see it as a clear win because they cannot be part of the UN unless they go before the Security Council, and Russia and other countries are not going to allow them to appear before the UN. So clearly, what would have been better is if there had been a true negotiated settlement, perhaps considering the rights of certain large Serbian minorities in the north of Kosovo, and so on and so forth. Instead, what happened was we essentially had a political act, and Kosovo's decided to rely purely on politicking to get more countries to recognize them.
Do you think we have inadvertently opened up a can of worms for ourselves here?
I really think so. Because of the World Court's decision and Canada's recognition of the secession of Kosovo, we really have a situation here where Quebec can say, why do we have to fulfill all these various things before we can declare our own independence? You have to have the House of Commons certify our referendum question. And even if we have a vote in favor of independence, the House of Commons also has to certify the result as a clear indication of Quebec's will. This is quite cumbersome when you consider Kosovo was permitted to secede, or at least its secession was recognized by Canada without any referendum whatsoever.
Now, obviously throughout the course of this, you've referenced the International Court, and I want to follow up on that. The International Court is not the last word in this country. The last word in this country is the Supreme Court of Canada. So does it matter what the International Court has had to say about this? The Supreme Court has already said the Clarity Act is constitutional.
I think as a matter of domestic law, that's 100% accurate. But I want to make 2 points about that. First, the Clarity Act applies to the province of Quebec. One interesting note of the way that Kosovo declared its independence, it wasn't actually Kosovo's assembly that was established under the UN resolution. It was a combination of the leaders in the assembly and some other leaders. In other words, it's an open question to me whether the Clarity Act would apply if it was not the National Assembly of Quebec that were to declare its independence, but simply a collection of sovereigntists who claim to be speaking on behalf of Quebec without necessarily being the Assembly. That's the first point I'd like to make. The other point I'd like to make is, as the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized, the question of secession is not only governed by domestic law, it's also governed by international law. The Supreme Court specifically stated that there was no conflict between our domestic law and international law on the question of secession. I think after the World Court's decision, notwithstanding the fact that it addressed a very narrow question, that is thrown into some doubt. Because the World Court not only did not consider the human rights angle, it did not even look at the lack of a referendum and the lack of really good faith negotiation between Serbia and Kosovo.
In which case, how likely is it that this decision of the International Court of Justice has set a precedent for other, call them what you want, rebel groups, secessionist groups, whatever, around the world to unilaterally declare independence and have it succeed?
I think the question of succeeding and the question of them declaring independence have to be separated. Ultimately, I think what the World Court's decision tells us is that recognition of a secessionist movement is fundamentally determined by politics. And clearly, we don't have an immediate danger here in Canada while the sovereigntist movement is not that popular. But we, of course, don't know what the future will hold. But I will note that the Parti Québécois was very welcoming of this decision and was very welcoming of the Harper's government's recognition. I would also note that a lot of democratic countries that do have their own separatist movements did not act the same way that Canada did. I think those facts alone should make us a little bit concerned about Canada's recognition of Kosovo without making it clear that they did not necessarily approve of the way that Kosovo declared its independence.
So do you think there's something we should be doing about this now?
I think one thing we could be doing behind the lines is seeking to augment support for the Clarity Act internationally, to make it clear that everyone agrees that the Kosovo situation was a one-off situation, and that if Quebec were ever to separate, they would have to fulfill all these stringent conditions, such as having the House of Commons certify the question of the referendum as well as the result. That is something that I'm not really sure is occurring behind the scenes. And in fact, Quebec has made quite a few actions that are not necessarily consistent with it being playing along as part of Canada. For example, Quebec has signed treaties with countries. There's a treaty right now with the United States. To me, it's an open question why a province is signing treaties with a country like the United States. So I think one thing that could take place is Canada ensuring that there's broad international support for the terms of the Clarity Act.
Understood. Milan, it's good of you to come in and visit us at TVO tonight. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.